Tonight, a portrait of the man who climbed aboard the American dream, bought it, and then sold it all over the world. The most famous artist since Picasso, Andy Warhol. When Andy Warhol died in February of this year, he was probably the most famous artist in the world, and it was characteristic of Warhol that many people weren't quite sure what he was famous for. It was pop art in the 60s that first made his name, and although he didn't invent the movement, he certainly produced its most enduring image, the Campbell's soup can that brought the modern world of the supermarket into the art gallery. Warhol was often dismissed as a con man, particularly early on in his career. But the case for the defense argues that behind the apparent simplicity of his work lies an acute understanding of mass culture. He's the iconographer of the 20th century American dream, or nightmare. Kim Evans' South Bank Show film is a celebration of a unique man whose career covered painting, film, publishing, rock music and television. And he still managed to attend every party in town. Warhol, they said, was the joker who'd turn up for the opening of an envelope. His was the classic American rags to riches story, the child of a Catholic immigrant family who was born Andrew Warhola in Pittsburgh in 1928.
Really attempt to be another Andy Warhol. His physical presence, his facial characteristic, his complexion, his basic outline was singular. You couldn't model yourself after that. But he liberated the art world in his dealing with images, along with people like Lichtenstein and Wesselmann and Oldenburg. He was a liberator in that the entire attitude of the art world shifted at the time that his art occurred.
Andy was from the beginning a conceptual artist. Duchamp said of Andy, what is interesting about Warhol is not the retinal image of the man who paints 50 soup cans, but of the man who has the idea to paint 50 soup cans. And that's precisely what I think I realized too, that it was the idea of the art, the idea of what the image and the pictures were going to be, that made Warhol significant from the beginning. I mean, as you look about the paintings in this exhibit, there's an extraordinary preoccupation with the thingness of things. With Andy, you have somebody who was saying, you know, in a sense, 16th, 17th century Spain was about saints. Well, 20th century America is about this.
It was very hard to put your finger on exactly what Andy Warhol was. And there are a series of celebrities in America who have been like that. I mean, for example, Marilyn Monroe, certainly, Elvis Presley, certainly. These celebrities who are like, you know, they do some great work, but then later on they become themselves more important than their work. Their every gesture, their every action, their every word becomes something. Andy, more than any of them, knew that, understood it, and knew how to manipulate it and use it.
And you should just tell me the words and I can just repeat them because I can't, I'm so empty today, I can't think of anything. Why don't you just tell me the words and they'll just come out of my mouth?
No, don't worry about it, because...
No, I think it'd be so nice.
But we'll
All right,
we'll loosen up after a while.
Well, no, it's not that. It's just I can't, I have a cold and I can't,
Okay.
think of anything. And it'd be so nice if you told me a sentence.
Let me ask you some questions that you can answer.
Oh, no, but you repeat the answers, too.
When Andy was ill as a child, he spent 3 months in bed, and that's when he started to develop his fixation on movie stars, Hollywood, the magic kingdom. He wanted to be Greta Garbo, he wanted to be Marilyn Monroe. And ultimately, actually, he achieved that, of course, which is what's so fantastic.
Oh, this is so glamorous. I forget who I'm calling.
Warhol's story had the fairy tale elements that America loved. He grew up in a strongly Catholic immigrant family, which had come to the United States from the mountains on the borders of Russia and Czechoslovakia.
I grew up in a somewhat of a section of Pittsburgh, a Slovak section. It was a difficult time for families then. I mean, he grew up during the Depression. The family was a working class family. Andy's father died when he was probably around 12 years old, and my father at the time was 18, and so my father took over the responsibilities of a father in supporting the family. Andy's mother, as I view it, she probably had the most influence on Andy when he was growing up, and I always saw her as being the creative talent that maybe Andy got his creativity from. Andy, when he was younger, he had a nervous condition. Andy's mother, Julia, worked with him and helped him with sketching and kind of kept him busy. But I think she was probably the most influential one all the way up until she passed away. She lived with him for approximately 20 years. And also, Andy liked her handwriting so much, and it was very decorative, and he'd often have her sign his name and do a lot of the inscriptions on the illustrations.
In 1945, Andrew Warhola, as he was then known, became the first member of his family to go to college, when he won a place to study art at Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh.
My father has a few paintings that he's treasured since Andy left Pittsburgh in 1949. These paintings are ones he did in school, and I think they're some of his most interesting works since they're all hand-painted.
One of the people who seemed to fade into the background was Andy Warhol, or Warhola as his name was at that time. And he emerged, however, in my recollection, very strongly as a marvelous drawer. I mean, he could draw beautifully. And he, in a way, could only go his own route, so that you would see a continuity between the work he did in college and the work he's done all his life.
Andrew Warhol's ambition was to be a painter, but in 1949, when he graduated, he was attracted by the glamour of New York, where he changed his name to Andy Warhol and plunged into the commercial art world.
First printed piece was in Glamour, and prophetically it was about an article on success. And essentially that was illustrations of ladders and people climbing ladders and shoes on ladders. The shoes seemed to emerge early in his career. he became the best shoe drawer in New York City. He was probably a dream to work with, because he never objected when the client asked him to change something. He, in fact, liked the idea that he was directed. I believe, to the end, I don't think he knew when a thing was good or bad. I think he had to be told.
Although Andy Warhol became a hugely successful commercial artist, his ambition was always to make it as a painter. But in 1961, when he met the dealer Ivan Karp, he was still unsure of the direction his work should take.
I went to the back of the space, and there were two bodies of work. First picture I think I saw was the painting in the corner here of Dick Tracy and a cohort. I said, well, you know, if you're going to deal with very brutish imagery like this, and believe me, the art world's going to find this very hard to take, because this was not the prevailing tradition. In fact, there was no imagery in the prevailing tradition. The artists working with imagery during that interval were considered outsiders. The dominant force was abstract expressionism. And the great heroes, of course, were Jackson Pollock and de Kooning, Klein, Rothko. Everybody's heroes, you know. And that was what you had to paint. You had to paint expressive style out of your soul, you know. The idea of doing images, blank, blunt, bleak, stark images like this, was contrary to the whole prevailing mood of the arts. But it gave me a chill seeing it, and in the vast intellectual, perceptual abilities that I had, I said, my word, this is an amazing idea. It's just the opposite of what we see these days, you know. He said, well, do you really like them? I said, well, they are astonishing, but I like some better than others. He said, well, which ones? I said, well, some of the paintings here have all kinds of drip marks. And he said, well, you have to do that. You must drip. I said, well, why must you drip? He said, well, it means that you're an artist if you drip. And then, of course, you're paying homage to Pollock and all the great dripsters, you know. And I said, well, no, you don't have to drip. Maybe you don't have to drip at all. Maybe if you're going to deal with these kind of simple images, why don't you just deal with them in God's name? You know, that was my program for him already. He said, oh, that's just wonderful that you should say that. He said, because I don't think I want to drip.
Before you started the silkscreen, you made a number of paintings, and you made comic strips, right?
Oh yes, I made comic strips. Before I did the silkscreen things.
And you made some other paintings of things that were not done mechanically. What were they?
I made, I guess they were ads in magazines.
And then you made,
and then I made
things like,
For a commercial artist to attempt to be taken seriously as a fine artist is very unusual. Now, not only did Andy, who was a famous commercial artist, come into the art world making no bones about the fact that he'd been a commercial artist, but he used as his subject matter the very subject matter of commercial art, i.e. advertisements or products. This was doubly shocking. This was like slapping someone in the face and then throwing up some boiling water in their face afterwards just to make sure they got the point.
Do you ever bother to read all these great interpretations about your work?
Can I just answer?
Yes, you can. Back in 1962, or 61 or 62, around in then, when you and Rosenquist and Lichtenstein all were working very independently of each other, but evolving a same kind of attitude. Does that seem odd to you, that you all began to look at the world in the same way?
I think we just read a lot of comic books. And it just happened to come out then.
Well,
because comic books make things the way they are really today. I mean, the way things happen in New York now, it's like being in a Western movie.
Well, if you understood the mood of the American art scene at that point, this was totally contrary to it, you know. There was a sense of buoyancy and optimism in this work, and it was all about observing things outside of the self. These were objects from the daily world, from the commercial world. And if somebody was going to look at objects, why would they look at these unholy things, you know? So it was a total outrage, essentially, in the corpus of art of that moment.
All of those people were indulging in a kind of aestheticism. They were They were dreaming a theory of art that was airy and godlike, and Andy finally pulled the rug out from everybody by saying, you know, this thing is a thing we call a painting, and it makes no difference what it is, and anybody can paint it. In fact, nobody has to paint it. My assistant can paint it.
In his studio on East 47th Street, which soon became known as the Factory, Warhol, with his assistant Gerard Malanga, used the silkscreen process to produce paintings on an assembly line. Warhol had also been working on himself, turning his defects, his shyness, his unnatural pallor, and his wigs into an image.
Well, I remember the first week or two working with him, I was absolutely petrified as to the way he looked. I mean, he was just so strange looking. And he didn't really get settled into the factory until January, maybe early February of '64. So really getting settled in, so we created a workspace, and I think some of the first things we did during that period were the Brillo boxes and the Campbell soup can boxes and the Kellogg's boxes.
Of the boxes, Brillo boxes, which created quite a sensation. It was just inconceivable that a gallery would give over its space to these piles of boxes. And we didn't really have any idea what kind of price to put on them because we didn't anticipate any sales, you know. We came up with a price, I think, $250 per unit, you know. I think maybe 2 or 3 were sold during that interval. But a lot of people turned up for the show because they'd heard that this sensational thing had taken place. And whatever critical response to the show was, and I don't remember it clearly, there must be some documentation on it, was essentially quite negative, even fierce and rather demonstrably unpleasant.
Andy, do you feel that the public has insulted your art?
No.
Why not?
Well, I hadn't thought about it.
It doesn't bother you at all then?
No.
Well, do you think that they've shown a lack of appreciation for what pop art means?
No.
Andy, do you think that pop art has sort of reached the point where it's becoming repetitious now?
Yes.
Do you think it should break away from being pop art?
No.
Are you just going to carry on?
Yes.
And Warhol did carry on to become the most controversial artist in America. The apparent easiness of the silkscreen process he used, taking a photograph for the initial image, seemed to deny everything that the fine art world stood for. Each of his early exhibitions was a media event.
Oh, there's Marilyn Monroe, what? Oh, yes, there. She looks beautiful. Did you ever see her in the movie? Who did that picture? So much gold. Oh, you know, that pop artist. What's his name?
There were always mistakes. Maybe there was something that was off register, we missed our registration mark, and there might have been a little bit of the painting showing through the black area or the edge of the face, and we just kept it. Andy liked the idea that, you know, he wasn't going to, it was all part of the art, part of the process. Portraits of people that he didn't know, which was highly unusual, because usually when you read through the history of art, usually it's always somebody painted a portrait of someone that the artist knew, in a sense, or that the artist was commissioned to paint. There was a detachment. He never met these people at the time, but he used them because they were popular images.
By the mid-60s, Warhol himself was a popular image. The media interest was fueled by the glamorous, exotic entourage that seemed to live at his studio, the Factory.
Andy paid the rent. He got this place, and he had all these people in it. and they all did their own thing. You know? And we'd sit, Andy would be painting, I'd be lying on the couch drawing in my notebooks. Gerard had set up a little desk for himself over in the corner by the telephone where he would write his poetry. Billy Linick, who took care of the factory and slept there at night, you know, had his the phonograph going with playing his opera records. Maria Callas was blasting, you know. People would be running down to the corner to 2nd Avenue to Bickford's to bring Andy vanilla malts and hamburgers. And there was a payphone, it was silver. And we took this old freight elevator upstairs, and, you know, they painted the whole place silver, and we had this rotten old furniture from the street, this horrible old couch that had no springs in it. And, I mean, that's where Andy did the flowers.
Aside from that, we went full throttle into the Death and Disaster series.